Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our International Development and Innovation Seminar Series at the Open Universities. My name is Lorena Lombardozzi. I'm a senior lecturer in economics here at the OU. And today I'm very delighted to introduce our friends and colleague Sophie van Huellen, who is a lecturer in development economics with the Global Development Institute at the University of Manchester and a research associate with the economics department at SOAS University of London. Research focuses on primary commodity markets, commodity chains and commodity dependence, financialization and financial speculation, and macro-financial linkages. She obtained the Bachelor in Economics, Politics and Philosophy from the University of Erfurt, Germany, and was further trained in economics with both a master and PhD at SOAS University of London. She will share with us a very topical problem issue and topic today about the financial speculation and global financial food crisis. We know that there's been a lot of discussions going on with food prices, food volatility, which has caused a lot of food insecurity and poverty. And Sophie will untangle a little bit of the processes and the formal and informal implication of those very important issues. As you all know, the video has been recorded and will be available for playback after, so people who don't want to be featured can ask questions in the Q&A and has to remain anonymous. You've been automatically muted, but please raise your hands if you want to ask a question, and please follow us on our newsletter, International Development Newsletter, and Twitter using the hashtag is the address is intdev_.ou. Craig will put the both address in the chat box. So without further ado, I think we are a very good crowd of very interested people and interdisciplinary spectrum of both food policy, economics, geography. So we're very happy, Sophie. Thank you very much again for joining us, and the floor is yours. I will flag when you have 5 minutes left, but yeah, please, I'll put my camera off and my mics off. Bye.
Thank you, Lorena, for this lovely introduction and also for the invitation. It's lovely to see so many familiar names in the audience. Let me share my presentation, which I have prepared for today. Give me a shout if you can't see it. Otherwise, I assume.
Yes, perfect.
Excellent. Okay. So as Lorena said, I will talk about financial speculation and the global food crisis and how these two are linked. So we have seen a lot of, we have felt and heard a lot about the global food crisis. We have seen double-digit inflation in the UK and in other countries as well, almost globally. At the same time, there has been a debate about the drivers and the narrative that underpins this global food crisis, and that's something that I will unpick today. And I will make the argument that rather than having a food supply crisis, which is the way in which is often depicted in the media, we actually do have a food price crisis. That is not to downplay the implications, actually equally severe. But when we think about what are the solutions to the current crisis, the starting point is very different if you talk about a supply crisis and a price crisis. So the outline, very quickly, I will first kind of just give the background and the context of the global food crisis. I will then talk about why I think it is a price crisis rather than a supply crisis. Then I have one part, which is the third section of the presentation, which is slightly technical. I'm quite aware that we have an interdisciplinary audience, which means some of you will be quite familiar with the intricacies of commodity derivative markets. Others might not be as familiar, so I've catered more for those who are less familiar with that in order for you to understand the technicality. So please bear with me if you know everything about commodity derivative markets already. And the last part is really to then kind of zoom out and say, see what is the bigger picture. So who does benefit and from the current food crisis, from the past food crisis, and what does it tell us about the state of our current food system? Now, well, acute food insecurity by the World Food Programme has more than doubled or the amount of people who are living under acute food insecurity has more than doubled in the last couple of years. And of course, that is related to the tremendous price increase. This has led the IMF to offer emergency funding, or what they call a food shock window funding, as part of the emergency financing, and quite a few countries have been forced to access that emergency financing in order to tackle the implications of the global food crisis, especially countries that are food import dependent, which of course have a massive import bill to stem now, with implications for their current account. At the same time, we have seen several countries, 23 actually, judging by the World Bank report in just this month, 23 countries who have initiated bans on exports of food and or have introduced limiting measures or measures that limit the export of food in order to secure the food availability of their own citizens. So at one hand, we have food import dependent countries who are facing an incredible threat to their current account by the increase in food prices, and at the same time we have seen countries, because of the anxiety around the availability of food, introducing measures that curbs the export of the food that is being produced within their borders. Now, all of this is reminiscent of the previous food crisis, and in particular the 2008-2009 crisis, and then the 2010-2011 crisis. And at the right-hand side, you can see the World Bank Food Price Index and how it has developed. This is nominal prices since the 1980s, and we clearly see that the first spike, something that is for most of us in very vivid memory, the 2008-2009 food crisis, and then shortly after 2010-2011. Now, after that, food prices remained relatively low, at least the 2016 to 20, and then just as the pandemic hit, we see this massive spike again in food prices. Now, the reactions and the implications of these food price booms have been very similar. So in these the food crisis that we have seen in the past, these kind of dynamics were tied to social upheaval, civil war back then, the Arab Spring, widespread hunger and malnutrition that has worsened globally, and to some extent, at least ex post, if not during the time these crises materialized, there was a recognition that actually we have seen a food price crisis rather than a supply crisis. And that's true for the last two crises. And now, again, I would argue that what we're seeing today is also a food price crisis rather than a supply crisis. Now, what are the drivers that are currently cited as the justification for these ballooning food prices? One is supply chain disruptions, which of course have unfolded during the COVID-19 crisis, but then had ripple effects and repercussions throughout. We have a shortage of workers and so on and so forth. So these disruptions are ongoing, but not as severe as they were during COVID, of course. Then we have an increasing cost of production. Again, that was something we have to remember that has been present in the previous two food price crises as well. The production costs are mainly linked to fertilizer and cost of transport, so very much to gas. Gas is the main input for fertilizer production, and energy, so oil and gas prices. Now, oil and gas prices have seen a similar boom during the previous food price crisis, and the boom in food prices and the boom in energy prices are not only linked to the cost channel, but they're also linked to a common denominator, which is the speculative craze that has driven these prices in all of these different scenarios. Then thirdly, we have seen extreme weather events and of course climate change being blamed for food shortage, and of course more recently, or most recently, the supply shortages that were feared to materialize as a result of Russia's attack on Ukraine, and the ongoing war of Russia against Ukraine. Now, I'm not arguing in this presentation that these factors have not played a role in the current food crisis. However, what I'm arguing is that these factors haven't contributed to food shortages, but they have contributed to food price increases, and that quite massively. So these factors do feed into the food price bubble. However, they don't materialize or don't result into a food supply crisis. And as I said from the onset, this is important because the policy implications are fundamentally different, and something that we have seen a lot of European countries already thinking about how to divert some of the food that is being used for feed for animal production into the food again, and also how to divert some of the biofuel, the food that is used for fuel, so for biofuel, away again from the production of fuel. Now, from a climate perspective, the diversion of food away from feed, so from the production of meat, is not a bad thing per se, of course. Biofuel is more complex. I'm just saying that these policies, rather than judging them whether they're good or bad, is they're very ill-placed to actually address the current food crisis, because it is not a supply crisis. So the problem is not limited supply, the problem is incredibly high prices. So the unaffordability of food rather than the unavailability of food. So why do we see a food price crisis? The primary starting point is that there's no food supply shortage. And this is something that I will show to you in the next two slides very clearly. Instead, what we see is a decoupling of the kind of what's called often fundamentals, which is the physical demand and supply conditions of a commodity, including a food commodity. And this decoupling then leads to a price reaction to something that is not based on the actual physical demand and supply of food. So we have a delink between what is called market fundamentals and the actual price of food commodities. Now, this does not mean that we don't have food shortages, especially locally. Unaffordability of food is one of the primary causes of food shortage in many areas of the world, and also in individual households. So whether we are unable to afford food, so we can't buy food, or we're unable to access it because it's not available, the result in both cases is, of course, we either starve or we malnourished, and so on and so forth. The other problem with the food price, a food price crisis and a food price boom, is that prices do signal shortages in supply. So there's almost a reverse causality going on, where a lot of countries seeing these ballooning food prices and at the same time are increasingly worried about the affordability of food in the future. So what that means is that a lot of countries, as we said at the very beginning, 23 actually have introduced various measures in order to either stock up their existing inventory in order to secure the food supply for their domestic citizens, or they put in export bans on export of food products, again in order to both control prices but also the availability of food within their own borders. So that's this anxiety then feeds into, if you want, a hoarding of food products, which in itself then feeds back into the anxiety and the price bubble itself. However, the starting point is a different one. The starting point isn't the shortage of food. The starting point is the high prices of food in the first place. So this additional demand can almost kind of validate the initial price increase ex post in a self-fulfilling manner. This is something that we see in a lot of speculative booms or bubbles. Now, there are two commodities which I will, or food commodities, which are staple foods, which I will look at in particular here. And the first is wheat, the second one is maize or corn. On the left-hand side, what you see is data that is collected by the FAO in collaboration with AMIS. AMIS has been introduced as a response to the last food crisis, where it was acknowledged we potentially had a food price crisis, and that speculation was one of the key drivers. The idea then was that speculation was only taking hold because there was an insufficient amount of information about the actual demand and supply of food. Now, as this figure clearly shows, even if the information about actual supply and demand is available, freely available for every person to see, that does not mean that we can't have a speculative bubble developing. This is inbuilt into the current food system. Now, let me go into the argument why I think there's a delinking between fundamentals and the food prices we see at the moment. The green line here is what's called domestic utilization. Now, domestic here is a bit mislabeled because this is the data for the world. The only thing is that that same data service can, of course, look at this for individual countries. And now it looks at the world. So domestic here means the world, our globe. So that's basically the amount of food that is being consumed is the green line. The amount of food that is being produced is the dashed black line, and the amount of food that is being stored in existing and known storage positions is the this blue bar. Now we see that the only year in which actually we had demand higher than the supply, so that our storage was diminished, global storage was diminished, was the 2018-2019 harvest period. Now, in that period, we see a minor increase in prices, a very minor increase in prices, after a continuous fall in prices from 2013, 2014. You have to remember, just before that, we still had the last boom and price crisis. Now, if you look at 2021-22 and then 22-23, where now we have the worry about the Ukraine crisis, and before that we had COVID, we have consistently demand below the actual production. So storage position have continuously increased. At the same time, and regardless of this development, we see a massive increase in prices, much higher than the increase in prices that we saw in the 1 year where actually production was short of the consumption that we saw in that particular year. Now for corn, it's a similar picture, maybe a little bit less pronounced, but very, very similar. So we see again that in the year 2021-22, we actually had again demand being lower than the actual supply, so annual supply. Still, and yet, despite that, we saw a massive spike in the price of maize. So these are what are called world prices or global prices. And usually when people say global or world prices, these are the reference prices that are set at commodity derivative markets. I will explain in a bit what these derivative markets are. The dashed line here is the overall food price index, and you can very much see that the rise in maize prices and in wheat prices are in line with the overall food price index, and these two commodities were particularly hit hard because they were discussed continuously together with oils as being adversely affected by the war in Ukraine. Now, one part of the story, and this is not something that I will deny, is definitely the cost side. So fertilizer prices at the same time have also skyrocketed. And fertilizer, as I said before, is basically gas. So energy commodity prices are tied to fertilizer prices. Inaffordability of fertilizer then also means that potentially it might have a knock-on effect on production. It hasn't happened yet, but potentially might have in the future. So that's the forward-looking speculation of people who are betting on higher food prices. Now, interestingly, the energy prices are equally delinked from demand and supply conditions. And actually, it has been much better documented, that delinkage in the case of energy than in food. But the story is very, very similar. We have speculators who are betting on future shortages of energy, thereby driving up the price, although we might not have an actual shortage of that energy. That doesn't mean, again, that they're not local shortages, but I'm talking here about global shortages, and these are global reference prices, which then have direct impacts for globally the prices of food. So keeping in mind that these energy or cost of production factors are also impacted by a speculation, I will get back to this at the very end. Let's think now about what speculation is, and this is the part where it might get slightly technical. So yeah, hopefully I'm not boring you. On the right-hand side is a picture that shows you, or tries to disentangle, the different types of traders that are positioning or taking positions on commodity derivative markets. The green line is completely and total speculative positions. And what we clearly see is that with the onset of the COVID pandemic, and then again, increasingly with the unfolding crisis in Ukraine, and then it has ballooned, and then it has been consistently high or persistently high until very relatively recently. Unfortunately, that graph here stops in April 22, but if anything, it has increased. This is just the example of the Paris week market. This is actually not the most liquid market. If you go to the American-based markets or the London-based markets, you see that same pattern emerging much more strongly. So what does it mean? What do we mean by speculative positions, and what are these commodity derivative markets? Now, speculative positions are usually referred to anything that, or any position that is taken in these markets that has not the intention to offset an existing price risk. The offsetting of an existing price risk is often referred to as hedging. And any position that is taken not with the purpose to offset, but to gain outright from an investment is called speculation. So it basically engulfs everything that is not hedging, almost like a negative definition. Now, what has driven that kind of speculative craze, if you want? There are different factors underpinning it, and they are linked, but not necessarily identical. During COVID, we saw a lot of so-called retail investors, and that's a relatively new development, going into commodity derivative markets. One of the reasons that there are two reasons for it. The first is the availability or the ease of trading in derivatives, exchange-traded funds via a mobile phone app. Now, every single person, you can download an app, you can start trading in commodity derivatives. This was not something that was possible a few decades ago. At the same time, during COVID, a lot of people who lost their jobs or were bored sitting at home went into ideas of how to make money quickly, or had excess liquidity lying around and were thinking about how to put it to good use. So this increase or ballooning of retail investors, together with a lot of kind of financial influencers making their way through our YouTube channels, then resulted in a boom of these retail investors, not only in commodity derivative markets, but also in stock markets and in other types of markets as well. But derivative markets were affected as well. At the same time, we had a narrative of rising food prices or food shortages. Now, food shortages were projected and or predicted in the onset of COVID because of supply chain disruptions. And indeed, we had empty supermarket shelves and so on and so forth. So that picture of the empty supermarket shelves, the worry and anxiety about food supply shortages, that a lot of people then invested and think, okay, let me turn this into my benefit, right? I want to have a piece of that cake, so I'm investing in commodities, in food commodities, in order to gain from the price rise that will materialize once that shortage comes about. Now, in a similar vein, after the COVID pandemic, we had a similar storyline unfolding at the beginning of the war in Ukraine. So when Russia marched into Ukraine and attacked Ukraine, the headlines were full of stories of how this war will materialize or realize food shortages globally, and especially prominent financial news agents were very much pushing that story, including Reuters here and Bloomberg. So these are snapshots I took, and also The Guardian was, among a lot of newspapers. I put it here to show you it's not only financial and more conservative outlets that were pushing that story. Prominent think tanks and the news, big news outlets in general. Now, this meant for a lot of for investors, if you have the story of food shortages in the future, so the anticipation of food shortages means that I'm going into food commodities, food derivatives, in order to benefit from the price rise that will materialize once these food shortages hit the shelves. The problem is that these food shortages never materialized. However, the demand of investors who were forward-looking and wanted to have a piece of or benefit from these shortages, that demand materialized, pushing the current speculative bubble that we have. Now, speculators do intend to make a profit purely on the position taking in their markets. Now, this is very different from, as I said before, from hedging, which is taking an offsetting position. Usually hedging is done by traders or producers much less, but large trading houses are usually the big hedgers in these markets. What they do? If they know they take on or they will buy a certain commodity at a particular point in time, and then they will resell that commodity in a particular point in time. During the time where they hold that commodity in their storage, if the price changes, they either make a gain or they lose money out of this. In order to ensure that this potential loss of the storage position is offset, they can take a reverse position in the commodity derivative markets. And ideally, theory says or has it, you have a perfectly offsetting position, and therefore your price risk is minimized. This is the actual justification of the existing of these commodity derivative markets. The second justification is the price discovery. So this is the notion of a perfect market or a competitive market which will reflect at any point in time actual demand and supply. Now, these markets are very liquid, and because of that liquidity, often they are being assumed to be the most adequate reflection of actual physical demand and supply. Now, there are lots of flaws with this theory, and in the discussion, if you're interested, we can go into all the things that are wrong with it. But for now, I'm just leaving it there as an ideology that justifies the use of these markets. Now, speculators can usually be distinguished, or we can distinguish between two types of speculators, and that depends on what their motives are, but also the way they engage with these markets or they're active in these markets. There are some speculators who want to gain outright from price movements. So they're usually more short-term in their investment, and they're called active investors because they take a view on how the market will move. Then you have investors who are purely interested in these markets because they want to diversify their portfolio. It's almost like investing into a stock index, right? You invest into an index of equity because then that way you have a relatively diversified portfolio. So theory says that the chance of you losing all your money is relatively slim. Now, commodities are another asset class, so they're being added to this portfolio in order to diversify your portfolio. One factor that has pushed this passive investment quite a lot very recently is, of course, the rise of inflation. Now, the story of primary commodities to be a hedge or an insurance against inflation has already taken hold in the early 2000s. Back then, we had relatively low inflation, but also a very, very low interest rate environment. So still, if you would invest in safe assets, inflation would eat up your investments. So inflation was higher than the interest that you would be able to gain or earn on any relatively safe assets. So therefore, back then, commodity derivatives were advertised as a good investment opportunity. Now, even more so that we have a high inflation environment, these commodities are being advertised, or primary commodities, including food commodities, are being advertised as a means to ensure that your assets are not declining with inflation. Right, so you get a yield that is higher than inflation because, of course, inflation is nothing else than a basket of representative consumer goods. Food, fuel, energy prices are very much part of that basket, of course. So yeah, commodity price and inflation rise hand in hand. Now, how do commodity derivatives markets work, and why can speculation increase or lead to speculative bubbles? And this is where the technical part comes in. Futures contracts are often called derivatives, and they're standardized contracts. So they're a contract about a future sell or purchase of a food commodity. These commodity derivative markets are regulated financial markets which trade these standardized contracts. So each contract has the same commodity specified, the same quality, the same quantity, and so on and so forth. Now, prices that are being set at these commodity derivative markets are being used as reference prices in the actual physical purchase and selling of food. So it's not that these commodity derivative markets exist separately from the actual production of food. They're very much part of it. So these are reference prices that are being used. That also means that if we have a speculative bubble in these markets, we have a direct impact on the food price that we see as consumers, as in our supermarket shelves. Not all food commodities are traded on derivative markets, but a lot, and especially kind of staple food items. So you can trade wheat, corn, soybeans, more recently rice, oil, different oil seeds, all sorts of different meat products, dairy, all sorts of different beverages from, and even now increasingly fresh fruits and vegetables, which is something that hasn't been as prominent earlier on. Each derivative contract needs two sides to come into existence, one buyer and one seller. Now, the buyer is called a long trader in the jargon of derivative markets, and the seller a short trader in the jargon of derivative trading. When these two traders agree on a price, then a contract is being opened. So the contract doesn't exist before, but a contract is being opened of that standardized type as soon as these two agree. That contract is being created by something that's called the clearinghouse. So the seller and the buyer, they are being put together or put in touch anonymously by that clearinghouse that then issues that contract. Now, this clearinghouse maintains what's called an order book. An order book has where all is a book basically, which has two sides. One is where all the prices that the buyer is willing to pay are registered, and one side where the prices that the sellers are willing to sell for are registered. And if these two prices are met, a trade happens, and then a contract comes into it. The number of contracts at any point in time that are opened at a particular exchange is called open interest. That's not very important, but I refer later on to open interest. So just keep in mind, it's just the number of contracts that are open. The commodity trading or the food derivative trading is incredibly leveraged. Now, none of these traders, the buyers or the sellers, need to pay the face value of that commodity. What they do instead is they deposit a security deposit in what's called a margin account with the clearinghouse. This means that as time goes by, the value of that contract will change as new contracts open, the last reference price is being used. So the value of the existing contracts also changes with time. Now, the price change benefits, if it goes up, it benefits the long trader. If it goes down, it benefits the short trader. So the difference in the original price and the later price is either a gain or a loss for one side of these different contracts. All the gains are being deposited on the margin account for the trader that made the gain. So let's say the price goes up, the long trader gains. So that is deposited on their margin account. The short trader loses, and that is being taken from their margin account. If the margin account goes under a certain limit, they're being asked to replenish that account. That also means that you need not even a fraction of the amount of money that you would need if you wanted to do the same thing in terms of physical trading. Physical trading or speculating with the physical commodity rate, you would have to have the money in place to buy the 1,000 bushels of wheat. You then need to hold these bushels of wheat in storage, and then you would sell them on. So there would be a lot of money involved. For commodity derivative contracts, you don't need any of this. You just need a fraction to ensure that you can pay the price difference that materializes as the price of the derivative changes. So it's very, very easy to trade in these derivative products, and that also makes them very liquid, these markets, but also make them very prone to speculation. Now, these markets have seen a massive inflow of so-called non-traditional investors. They were highly speculative before, but if you want, it blew out of proportion in the early 2000s. That came after waves of deregulation, especially in the US, and then a growing interest of financial market investors to invest in commodities as another asset class. Part of that craze was driven by the idea of another commodity super cycle driven by China and India, that's for the interest of a lot of financial investors in commodity and commodity derivatives, including food. Now, the idea that commodities hedge or insure against inflation has been another factor, of course, that also drove that. And then ease of trading. So we have seen an incredible innovation craze, if you want, when it comes to the products that are being offered now even to retail investors. So you have exchange traded funds that are based on commodity derivatives, which are easily traded as similar to stocks, just via your mobile phone app. We just between 2000 and 2008, where we had the first speculative bubble building up, open interest, so the number of contracts in a lot of these markets on average multiplied more than fivefold. So you have a fivefold increase in the number of contracts that are open in these accounts. And this is not because the volume of wheat or corn that is being produced has increased fivefold. This is because you have a fivefold increase in the number of speculators in these markets. Now, how does this speculation affect prices? For some of you, it might be intuitive. For others, maybe less so, and it depends on maybe your background, but also the position that you take or your view of how markets operate. And as I said before, they're passive traders and they're active traders. So the passive traders are the ones that only invest long, so they only take on buying positions. Active traders take a view on the market, and usually what they do is they increase existing price trends. So these are the traders that are basically triggered or motivated to make an investment on the basis of the headlines that we just viewed earlier. So if there are headlines about future shortages, then they want to have a piece of the cake of these future shortages, which will, in their mind, increase prices. So they're also taking on long positions in these markets. Now, on the right-hand side is my attempt to draw an order book that sits with the clearinghouse. At the bottom, you have the price. At the y-axis, we have the number of contracts. Or the number of offers, if you want. Now, the two kind of butterfly wings at the bottom are what would be the short and the long positions if there were no speculators in the market. So we have some people who are interested in selling and some people who are interested in buying. Where the two sides intersect, contracts will be opened and an agreement will be made. Where none of them intersect, then there's no trade, right? So some will offer a price that is too low for any of the short asks to agree on, and so on and so forth. Now, what happens if we have speculators answering on one side of the market only? So these are either driven by their passive investment, so they don't really care about the market, they don't take a view, they just want to diversify their portfolio, or they're driven by the headlines and the anxiety about future shortages, and they want to have a piece of that cake. Assume they all take long positions, then we have the top part materializing. So the order book changes. And of course, as a result of this, we also see a change in price. It's a standard demand and supply model, if you want, as it with any market, other market as well. The only thing here is that the demand and supply, and this is where a lot of the misconception of the working of commodity derivatives and food markets, food derivative markets comes about. The demand and supply here is not driven by the interest of these traders to obtain or sell actual physical food items. It's demand and supply for an asset, for a contract which is never meant to actually result in the physical exchange of a food item. So that non-physical or financial demand does not necessarily reflect the demand of the actual physical commodity. That means you have two different markets going on. Now, if the physical market is referenced against the derivative market, then of course you have a problem, and you see that delinking of the market fundamentals and the actual commodity price. Now, especially in times of high uncertainty, we have these kind of speculative, vicious cycles of food bubbles. Now, that means that if these investors going into these markets, you see prices increasing, that means other traders who have maybe been a bit more hesitant now going into these markets as well, and everyone expects a future shortage of food to materialize, and then again buys into both the narrative and then also starts stockpiling in the physical market. And you have this as almost like a self-fulfilling bubble building up, of course, until it bursts. So all of the previous bubbles burst, this will burst as well as the previous did. This matters because these prices are immediately used as the reference prices for physical exchange. Now, the big question is, if we know that these derivative markets are prone to speculative bubbles, why are they then used as reference prices to actual physical food commodities? And there are two reasons for that. One is pure ideology. There's a belief in the efficient market, and there's the belief that this is the price that best reflects actual demand and supply. Again, happy to debunk that myth in the discussion section if anyone is interested. The second part is that a lot of powerful players have an interest to use these markets as the reference price. And these powerful players are the commodity or food trading houses. Now, this leads me to my large section, which is the big question of who benefits and what does all of this talk about speculation actually tells us about the state of our global food system. Now, we have just 4 companies globally, usually referred to as A, B, C, D, because their names almost neatly fit into the beginning of the alphabet to abbreviate them. So these 4 trading houses hold or facilitate 70 to 90% of the global grain trade. So depending on what grain we're looking at, 70 to 90%. So the market is incredibly concentrated, both for farmers, so farmers who are producing these crops don't have much choice whom to sell to, and consumers who are consuming these food items also have not much choice on whom to actually purchase the food from. At the same time, these trading houses are the only actors who are persistently active on both the derivative markets and the physical markets, and at the same time, they're both buyers and they are sellers. The money they make comes purely from price differences and speculation on these derivative markets themselves, as well as speculation with actual inventory positions. They have an interest of having a close relationship between the derivative markets and the actual commodity markets. If they want to offset their price risk, if they have any, that is only possible to do by using derivatives if these prices match. So at some point, the price of the physical commodity has to be the same as the price of the financial commodity. To ensure this, the derivative price is used as a reference in the physical contracts. And that ensures for them that these prices do match more or less perfectly. And if they wish to hedge a price risk, so they take a view on the market that prices move to their disadvantage, they will use the market to hedge. Otherwise, they might actually use the market to speculate. Now, whenever prices are booming or markets are incredibly volatile, that means more opportunity for these actors to make money or to benefit. Now, this is just a figure on the right-hand side that shows you the net profits, or the annual revenues, actually, not the profits in this graph. The profits made by 3 of them. The 4th one, so Cargill is a private one. So only ADM and Bunge are listed. But one thing that we can see that for all of them, whenever we had a commodity or a food crisis, their profits have been exorbitant. And this crisis is no different. At the same time, we see that farmers are not the one who are gaining from these price increases. Why? Because of that concentrated buyer power they are facing. So while these trading houses use the price boom as an excuse to pass on higher prices to supermarkets, and then eventually they pass it on to consumers, this is not being accepted for farmers, who then start struggling with the rising production costs. So that means, because of the concentration, or how concentrated our global food system is, we see a squeeze on both the producer side and the consumer side, and that can have potentially quite dangerous consequences. This is just to show you, and this leads back to the original story about fertilizer being also subject to speculation, just to show you that for large fertilizer corporations, the story is identical. So you have these speculative bubbles, and at the same time, these companies are the main benefactors of these speculative bubbles. So these are the biggest fertilizer companies globally, and you see how their profits have consistently increased exorbitantly in 2022. So they are huge benefactors of the food crisis. Now to my very last slide. The consequences of a food crisis we're quite aware of. I mean, whether this is a food supply crisis or this is a food price crisis, the consequences are quite similar. So the WFP stated that their monthly operating costs have gone through the roof, a 44% increase, and also issued a report just in June 2022 where they said that in South Sudan, food assistance had to be suspended as funding was drying up. So the food price boom then results in actual food shortages where countries are dependent on the imports or the affordability of food. However, from a policy perspective, implications do differ quite dramatically. So if it's a food shortage globally, then of course policy would have to look at how can we produce more food, because overall we have a food shortage. Now the problem is not how to produce more food, but the problem is how to reduce prices. And part of the price reduction then talks about or has to address the political economy of our global food system and the dominance and high concentration at different market segments by players who have an interest in maintaining these bubbles for a certain period of time, because they clearly gain exorbitant profits from that. And then, of course, there's a financialization story to that as well, because these exorbitant profits are then extracted into the financial sector through dividends, through share buybacks, and so on and so forth. So financialization story, both on the side of speculation, but also on the food price speculation, but also on the side of the activities of these large, highly concentrated multinational corporations which govern our food system. Thank you very much for listening. Let me try to get rid of the presentation.
Yeah.
How do I stop sharing? Okay, excellent. Now I can.
Thank you, Sophie. A round of applause, virtual applause, for this very thorough yet depressing picture of what is going on in the global food system. And yeah, a lot of questions, I guess, that will come up in the audience. I also have a lot of questions, but I will wait. So let's open the floor for questions. I can see that Susan, that was also showed is one of your slides as a co-author of one of your recent papers, as a question, and also Les, if you could please raise your hand. Yes, and maybe Craig, could you unmute the participants and please introduce yourself? Thank you very much. Yes, Susan and then Les.
Hello, I'm in a room with other people.
Nice.
Here we are. Thanks very much, Sophie. That was excellent. I've actually got 3.5 questions and a comment, I think. Is that all right?
Good.
Yeah.
Yes,
okay.
Of course. I mean,
yeah.
You're like the expert in the OU.
Well, but yeah, I'm just going to reiterate a bit of what you said, but also just trying to hang things a bit more together and stuff. And I'm really interested. The first thing I was interested and taken by was your discussion about retail investors and their rise since the pandemic, and then now as part, And I wanted just to know a little bit more who they are and what investment vehicles they use, and what side, what proportion of the market they take on. And the context of that question is that I just remember when I was looking at this stuff for coffee, like a long time ago now, you could see very clearly that, from the work I did, that hedge funds affected volatility, but not long-term price but index funds did affect long-term prices, as well as kind of co-movements across different commodities, which you're very aware about. So I just want to know a little bit about what investment vehicles these guys are using and how that then affects it. Is this because it seems that they're more active, aren't they? This seems like something that pushes what exists rather than a wider, longer-term deviation from supply and demand, which you might see with index funds, right? So that's one thing. And I wondered to what extent are the sort of wealth management companies like BlackRock and Vanguard really kind of tied to that? You know, and is this becoming more accessible? And that leads to this unwinding question that you were talking about towards the end of your presentation. You know, our lives are all completely tied to this. How do you unpack those power relations to disentangle that? That was one question. The second thing was also you bring in the traders later on, but I also think that we need to be really careful not to split everyone into speculators and hedgers, and to talk about speculative hedging much more, and the actual. So not only are they, it's not just that these commodity trading companies are like somehow kind of passive beneficiaries of, you know, financial, you know, is that they are themselves moving markets. And that article, that report in the Austrian, not the one we did, but the one by Bernard Troster and his author, sort of very much linked to that. And I think people like Joseph Baines also discusses this, you know, the extent to which this is the case or not. So that's one thing. It's just, yeah. So that leads on to sort of my question about how do we actually test this? Like, of course, I'm completely convinced by this, right? but for when we look at quantitative studies, for every study that says speculators move physical prices, there's another one that says speculators don't do anything to physical prices, right? So, oh look, there's some people in a different room in the same building. But yeah, so
see how chill we are.
So basically, I just want to know, like, is there a way we can, you know, and that's to do with the very complex and different ways in which trading takes place, isn't it? And that's to do, that fits in with my other question. And then the last thing is just add it really, is that, yeah, I think you're right in terms of the, you know, at the end it sort of reminded me about March's 10, you know, it's not the famine is not an issue of supply, but one of distribution. And it made me think again about the international commodity agreements, and I just wondered, and it seems like, you know, that kind of multilateralism might be what is needed, but I just wanted you to reflect a bit on its possibility, particularly with ABCD in the way. Thanks, sorry, I went on a bit. I'll be quiet now.
Hi, yeah, and I thanks, Susan. That's three very interesting questions. Actually 4, but yeah. I also wanted to thank and notice, Sophie, that we have the development departments joining from Milton Keynes, which is a very interesting story happening here, because we are famous for being an online university, and now you have like yeah, meetings going on face to face. But yes, okay. I don't know if you want to answer this question, or should I collect less questions as well, and then maybe do a second round after you reply? What do you think?
Maybe one more, since Susan had 4 questions. I can, like, one more I can take.
Yeah, you're very smart, but it's like, yeah, let's be reasonable. Okay, Leslie works on food as well. So maybe introduce yourself to say when you comes from. I noticed that there is a minor in this video. I don't want to that, but this is gonna be recorded, so just to let you know. But yeah.
Well, the minor seems to be applauding.
Yeah, exactly. She really enjoyed it. Yeah.
Maybe not the seminar, maybe something else. Anyway, yeah, thanks for the presentation. And I'm glad that you moved from food price speculation to the beneficiaries, namely those 4 companies that control most of the grain trade. But now I'd like to push the analysis further beyond simply those being beneficiaries, but those being architects. That is, they construct the global food system. They influence what is grown, where, and how, you know, as along with the price. Let's say the average price, you know, as well as the fluctuations through speculation. And in that respect, I'd like to ask, well, it's my argument as well as a question, ask whether there really is a supply problem, but in a qualitative sense, that is, in the types of food that are being produced and distributed. A different sense than the quantitative meaning of inadequate supply. And that is, I mean, this has been theorized since the 90s as a corporate food system, which was a drastic political shift in government policy by the leading industrial capitalist countries away from state regulation to basically market regulation or non-regulation, which thereby helped to facilitate the rise of these global grain traders, which in turn drive fundamental changes in land and resource uses around the world towards technology packages, capital-intensive inputs, whereby the farmer became what Jack Kloppenberg calls a propertied underlaborer. That is, even if the farmer owns the land, the farmer becomes an instrument of these global forces in both the inputs and the outputs. And this has severely damaged the ecological basis of food production, soil fertility, making it dependent on chemical fertilizers, degraded food quality, because now this grain trade is basically about producing animal feed, which is socially and environmentally destructive in many ways, plus the raw materials for processed food or ultra-processed food, which degrades the nutritional quality. Meanwhile, 70% of the people, at least in the global south, get their food by other means from small-scale producers who are largely outside that global system. But those producers are still being squeezed in many ways by this global system through land grabs, appropriation of land either by legal or illegal means, through price competition and so on. So in that sense, I mean, there is arguably a fundamental problem of food supply, meaning qualitatively what is produced and what is favored by this global system and by government policy, by contrast with the food that people need to eat.
Yeah. So what's the question, Les?
Well, isn't there really a problem of food supply in that qualitative sense? And that that most food that people eat for the nutritional benefit is relatively locally produced outside that global system and is being squeezed perpetually by what we call the global food system.
Yeah. Okay. Very good. Okay.
Excellent. Shall I go with Susan first? Yeah, so the retail investors mostly via exchange traded funds and exchange traded notes, which have ballooned for primary commodities. Of course, interestingly, also not only going into commodity derivatives, but also the equity, right? They're packaged in various ways and then sold on in terms of the equity holders of food producers, equity of, and that's where also BlackRock comes in, because a lot of these products, of course, then are being set up by institutions like BlackRock. When it comes, so you have the hedge funds and and as you said, exactly, right? So you have the hedge funds who are more active, they aggravate existing price trends, but on a short-term level, while index traders are pushing a long-term permanent increase in prices as they are in this market. Very much so. Couldn't agree more on the speculative versus hedges. I was trying to be careful with my wording there and not saying, so what is hedging and not what is necessarily a hedger. These big trading houses, they very much speculators on these markets as well, and arguably this is one of their core business. So the actual margins that are being made on the bulk trade of grain are relatively small. Where they make most of their profits is by either speculating on their inventory or speculating on the derivative markets. They are, couldn't agree more, they architects of the system. So that's I think something that you said as well. They very much architects of the system. They are not passive beneficiary. Yeah, the wording here was a bit, I would definitely rephrase that. They're not passive beneficiaries. They are driving the system, and the existence of commodity derivative markets cannot be separated from the existence of these large commodity trading houses, right? So they origin stories in the early grain trades in the US, Chicago, late 1880s, up until the 1920s, and then the colonial times. None of this can be disentangled because it's the same players. They might have changed names, but in the end, it's the same players. So the existence of these large trading houses are fundamentally linked with the derivative markets, and also how derivative markets impact the prices that we see as consumers and the squeezes that farmers are receiving. How can we test for this empirically? Yeah, so I wrote a very angry paper once in a Journal of Economic Survey, where I was ranting about how a lot of the empirical evidence that is seemingly presented against the impact of speculators having an impact on prices is the empirical tests are wrongly phrased. And there's also publication bias, and I don't take this word lightly. So I actually went and reviewed every single paper that was under the sun in 2020 up until 2020 or 2019, I think that's when the paper came out. And could prove, again, with regression analysis, that there's a bias against the papers that present evidence in favor of the speculation story maintain in the working paper stage much longer than the ones that provide evidence against it. And the reason being not necessarily that, I mean, part of it might be ideology, but part is also because the early literature was going so much against, finding evidence against. So if you then come and present evidence in favor, it is going against an almost established paradigm. So it is scrutinized much more rigorously. And one thing that there are at least half of the papers that come about trying to prove that evidence using Granger causality. Granger causality from the start, even those who have started using Granger causality at the beginning were then later on acknowledging that it does absolutely nothing to prove either one or the other story. But because it was the established methods from the start, it then ballooned into almost 50% of the empirical literature that has been produced on that using quite sadly actually Granger causality. So it is possible to actually empirically show that there is a relationship. And I've done that in a few of my old papers. You can clearly see that you have an impact of the hedge funds, which is more active, and it's going in the direction of where the boom goes and the bust goes, right? So they're aggravating existing price trends, and then with index traders, you have a level impact. Proving that the dealing between fundamentals, and yeah, I mean, Susan, you know that very well, empirically is very difficult because fundamentals are first the phrase, or I don't like the word fundamentals because in itself, it is a very loaded term, right? There is a hypothesis or a theory behind what should be fundamentals in the context of these derivatives. And we can, yeah, this can be contested as well. But the delinking of supply and demand and these prices is very difficult because often this data is only available annually, and that results in very short time series. So yeah, maybe in 20 years. We might be able to, but hopefully we don't have that problem anymore in 20 years, but I don't have very high hopes. International commodity agreements. Yeah, I mean, the international commodity agreements, again, as you know very well, have been undermined by, in large parts, ideology. They have been very successful for decades, and they would be able to be very successful again. So but the narrative is, of course, you have always one that defects. Now, defection was actually not the main problems of these agreements. It was the withdrawal of the main consumer countries, because for these agreements to stand, you need to be both have the consumers and the producer countries being on the same side, and then these agreements can actually work. Now, this is very much against the interest of these trading houses. They were having much smaller profits during the times of these commodity agreements, understandably, because their main income is from price volatility. So from a political economy perspective, I have little hopes that they come into existence again, also because the the free market ideology is very much ingrained in everyday politics as well. Les, I couldn't agree more. I think everything you said, I 100% sign up to. ABCDs are architects of this, as I said before. There is a supply problem in the quality. This has predated the commodity or the food price crisis. For a long time, we have seen a diminishing of the amount of high quality and the diversity of food. We're seeing obesity and malnutrition happening at the same time. And this is very much linked to how our global food system is being set up. These trading houses, as well as supermarkets, as well as food producers, are benefiting from having a small group of highly resistant food crops rather than having diversified food, and then also feeding low quality to lower income consumers, and then presumably higher quality to the few that can actually afford it, having like a two-tier or multi-tier system. And there's so much wrong with that. I think that would probably need at least 2 further seminars to unpack these dimensions. But yeah, I couldn't agree more. Also, the story about domestic farmers, even in countries where you don't have supermarkets, the supermarkets spreading out as widely as you have maybe in Europe, domestic farmers being squeezed as well, because you have the competition with these low price food products that are continuously trying to undermine local food supply sources. And of course, there's a whole story about how wage labor and low wages are relying on these very cheap food for subsistence. So yeah, it kind of feeds into a broader story of how global today's global financialized capitalism actually operates, and our food system is very much part of this. Yeah, so thanks. I take it more as an intervention and as a comment, because yeah, you're absolutely right there.
Thanks, Sophie, for answering very thoroughly all the questions and addressing. Is there any questions from the floor? Yes, Andrew Triggs, and someone in the audience? Yeah, I cannot. Yeah, go ahead, and then we. I see Dinar pointing someone and Theo pointing someone, but I can't see. Okay, but yeah, let's start with Andrew, and then let's see someone.
Okay.
Yeah. Go ahead.
You seem to be arriving at, and what Les was saying as well, arriving at a position that demand and supply, the demand and supply model doesn't work. You know, if these big companies are dominating production, then there's producer sovereignty. The demand and supply model works when there's consumer sovereignty. You know, what consumers want is produced. But also all sorts of other problems, of course, with the demand supply model. You know, Straffer's critique that no market could be partial. The food, difficult theoretically to have a partial market for food. But you were saying, about disentangling demand and supply being disentangled from finance. So are you saying that it does relate work for food in some sense, or is that could you be pushed a bit further to just say demand and supply doesn't apply at all to food? Or maybe that's the wrong position. Maybe there is some scarcity of food and it would apply in some, Ricardo said it applied demand and supply to diamonds. Those special cases where demand and supply. So just a theoretical question about that.
Thanks, Andrew. Very interesting. I can see Dinar has raised your hands. Someone in the room wants to ask something.
Hello, yeah. Can you hear us?
Yes. Hi, is it Frank?
Yeah.
Yes. Okay. Hi, Frank.
Hi, Lorena. Hi, everyone. Probably you might have covered this earlier on because I was busy with some other things a few minutes ago. My question is really about this idea of speculation. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, what I got from you, whenever there's a crisis, that's when speculation happens, right? So I'm trying to understand that when we don't have a crisis, does speculation still okay? And what drives those speculation when there's no crisis?
Yeah, interesting point. Do you want to answer these two, Sophie? Is that okay?
Yeah, why not? Because I think they actually linked. So thank you, Andrew. Yeah, so it is a theoretical question, which I think even goes further into what extent markets ever work. So that I think is, I mean, just picking up on the diamond example, I mean, the diamond market doesn't exist. The only successful full cartel in primary commodities that still exists until today. So yeah, diamond is definitely not a commodity that is traded on any market or driven by demand and supply. The question of whether you can disentangle, so at what point you have a disentangling of demand and supply from the actual price in itself is a technical one that leads back to the comment I made earlier about how we understand fundamentals, and this notion can be contested, which relates back to your story about when does demand and supply actually facilitate a complete market. The mainstream or the neoclassical narrative goes that you have demand and supply driving these markets, and this is physical demand and supply. There is a lot wrong with how food is being produced, which food is being put to the consumer, and this is not, there's no consumer choice, so a consumer can only consume what is being presented to them in a supermarket. So yeah, you have an incomplete market there. However, this disentangling is interesting in itself, I would argue, because it facilitates the argument that there is a link is the justification for the moral existence of these commodity markets, even from a neoclassical or mainstream perspective. So once you prove that this link is non-existent, you undermine the legitimacy of these markets, right? They don't have any legitimacy as a price discovery mechanism if they don't discover prices. So that's the argument I was trying to make here, which is much more narrow than your question about a complete market. And I think there's other half of that answer, or the response to that, relates to Frank's question as well. Is speculation then fine, or does it exist if there's no crisis? It's very much a fundamental component of these markets. So speculation exists outside of a crisis period as well. However, it does not necessarily drive a speculative bubble. But as you know, financial markets are cyclical, right? So what is inbuilt in these financial markets is speculation, which is an inherent component of financial derivative markets. And as soon as you have speculation as an inherent part of that, you also have speculative bubbles. It's in the nature of these markets. Now, the question then is, do we want to have or rely on the prices set by these markets for a commodity that is so fundamental as fundamental as food is? And my response then there would be no, we shouldn't. So we probably shouldn't rely on a market where speculation is an inbuilt component of these markets. Usually the neoclassical story goes that the speculation facilitates trading by providing liquidity, right? So providing the depths for these markets and for hedges to find a counterpart. But as Susan said at the very beginning, there has been another system in place, well, a couple of decades ago, and this system worked very well and actually worked better to ensure against high price. So it curbed the excess profits that could be made by the main players in the food system. And at the same time, it ensured that consumers and producers had some price stability. And there was an actual negotiation going on. So that you could make an argument that actually commodity agreements were more akin to a market that reflected any type of demand and supply than commodity derivative markets. Because, of course, these were also negotiated. I mean, this was producers and consumers sitting on the table and negotiating. So yeah, but it's a philosophical question, almost what facilitates the market and a market that formulates a price.
Yeah. I don't know if anyone has. Thanks, Sophie. Any other questions from the audience? We have 10 minutes left. Don't be shy. I don't want to point fingers, but I know many people knows a lot about these topics. But okay, in the meantime, that people think about it, can I jump in with one question about what you exactly you are talking about? Because, okay, let's assume an absurd utopic scenario, right? Where like pre-financial deregulation. And I mean, in the case of, for instance, China and post-Soviet countries who didn't deregulate, you have a system, whereas, for instance, I wrote the paper on Uzbekistan wheat, where you had now they have abolished, obviously, because they enter into the neoliberal era, but you had a system whereby you had the state who allocates a quota system of wheat, because wheat especially is instrumental for, wage, like kind of regulate wage, inflate like wage cost, but also to guarantee food security. And there is this terminology actually in the Chinese literature, which I don't remember, is that food security in a way is the same as food sovereignty. So you kind of, they actually think of food security as a system, whereas, this supply is not, as you said, it's not about, a gap, but it's about having stability in the system. So something that creates stability in the system is something that is being regulated at the state level, where you have allocated, production quota with a procurement prices established, and where you have even public processing companies who produces and buys a certain amount of this wheat locally, and you have certain, for instance, flour or bread sold in the market at subsidized price. Is this something that is like feasible in a context of global integrated, commercial integration, or it's something that is like it's impossible to re-implement in? I know it's a very extreme case, but it was like this until like a few years back. And there has been a lot of, as you said, like a lot of debate about then, okay, but the quality of the wheat, of the domestic wheat in some countries is not the same as, like the top quality wheat, like the drum wheat that is not produced everywhere in the world. But I'm just saying, is this kind of these tools, and we know that now we're talking about price control a lot in terms of consumption, micro price control. Is this possible to implement at this stage, or at least some aspects of this? I don't know if it's clear what
I think it is clear. It's more akin to a planning economy, but I think there are alternatives, right? If you juxtapose this highly financialized derivative system that we currently have to set prices, and then the planning economy on the other side, I truly believe that there's something in the middle that might actually work better. I think there's a general problem of having one market or one agency setting the price globally for wheat or corn or cocoa beans across the world. So there's a geographic delinkage between where prices are being formulated and where the prices actually then matter. And I think that's not the right approach. Whether these prices are set through the derivative market, or these prices are being set by some central agency in a kind of planning environment. I know a lot of people in Europe are thinking about, and also people who work on sustainable food systems are thinking about alternative ways of disentangling this highly centralized market and bringing it back to more regional and local markets, rather than kind of having these four highly powerful multinational corporations basically dictating everything, and that's going on our supermarket shelves, and then at the same time undermining any attempts of local producers to define an alternative. So I think these two things have to be linked. But even before the deregulation of these commodity derivative markets, I would argue that they did not necessarily work very well, because you have one reference price that is being set for 5-6 different countries in very different geographical positions. And that in itself kind of undermines the idea of this being a market for this actual crop or the actual food commodity, because you generalize that food commodity into something that can be standardized, and that in itself, right? So the need to have a commodity that is so standardized that it becomes exchangeable on a global scale, then is also one of the drivers that undermines the diversity of food that we can actually consume. So I think these things are linked, and the existence of these commodity derivatives markets have driven that level of standardization and narrowing of the food products that we see in our supermarket shelves, even before they have become deregulated and now are more susceptible to these speculative price booms. But even before the 2000s, when we have this dramatic inflow of financial liquidity, periodically there have been discussions about speculation driving food prices as well. So this is not a new, the scale has changed, but it's not a new development, and it even predates the deregulation of widespread deregulation of these markets. I think it's only became more pronounced and probably worse, but it's not something that is fundamentally new.
Okay, thank you. Right, any other questions? We have very few minutes left. I don't see any hands raised. Let me check the chat box. Sometimes there are comments. No, okay. So if there are any, no, Susan, you want to?
I was going to do a plug, but maybe Sophie wants to do the plug for our panels.
I know, please go ahead, Susan.
Yeah.
Sophie and I are organising a series of panels on commodities and political economy of price and macro and commodity dependency, all sorts of things, for the IPI conference, which will be in September. I think there's a call on Sophie's Twitter account, but the deadline's the 31st of March if you know anyone who's interested in that.
Yeah, we can put the link close to the video that has been recorded, and we are very thankful to Craig for organizing that, and we can actually add a link to the call. All right, thank you very much, Sophie. It's been a pleasure to have you with us, and I don't know, round of virtual applause.
Thank you, everyone, for wonderful questions. Really enjoyed it.
Thank you, Sophie. We'll have the next seminar will be, I think, on the 27th of April. We'll organize. I need to check, but these are about health and care value chains with Nicola Yates. So please join. We will find the details on Teams and on the website. And I'll see you soon, and enjoy the rest of the day. Thanks, Sophie. It was amazing, and as usual. Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Speak soon. Bye-bye.
Bye.